Good evening, friends. It's delightful to see you on this Sunday evening. This is pretty heavy stuff we're going to be talking about. It's history, it's documents, but for reasons that make no sense to me, it's incredibly divisive and incredibly emotional. And I wonder if we could have 5 minutes or 3 minutes of just settling in before we start. Okay, I'm going to start by reading a letter I got from the Jewish Voices for Peace yesterday. Now, Jewish Voices for Peace was started in around 2005 by Jewish kids on campuses who were absolutely appalled what's happening in the Levant. And Levant is the area that we call Palestine and Israel. And I wish I was shocked to tell you this. The Anti-Defamation League, ADL, is honoring Jared Kushner at this summit, at its summit on combating anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, the ADL is trying to mainstream a radical and dangerous definition of anti-Semitism, one that constitutes criticism of the state of Israel as a form of hatred against the Jewish people. You and I know that the true liberation for Jews can never come by oppressing and silencing Palestinians. Like generations of Jewish leftists before us, tens of thousands in Jewish Voices for Peace worked tirelessly to dismantle the institutions and structures that sustain injustice and grow something joyful, beautiful, and life-sustaining in their place. Now, why is the Anti-Defamation League mad at the Jewish Voices for Peace? That's because there's two groups. You have Zionism and anti-Zionism, and I'm going to go into that. But let's first read something even more extraordinary. I found the obituary for Desmond Tutu. Now, Desmond Tutu pretty much single-handedly helped, in the church, dismantle apartheid in South Africa because he wasn't arrested. And I heard him speak in Philadelphia in 1986. Absolutely charismatic. Wonderful, wonderful person. And when he died, the obituaries, instead of saying what incredible work he'd done over his long life, he was well over 90, they were accusing him of being anti-Semitic because he was supporting Palestinians. This was in 2021. Okay. So I'm really saying this just to show you that the vitriol that there is against anyone saying anything negative about Israel, which is really what it comes down to. Or as the Palestinians call it, the occupied Palestinian territories. Well, that's not opening up. Okay. I won't read it to you because it won't open up. But I can certainly. He died on the 26th of December, 2021. That's the thing. My computer always misbehaves when it feels like it. Okay, so anyway, I wanted to go right back to the beginning. Who were these Jews in Judea and Israel and what we know as Palestine around the time Jesus was there? Well, Jesus was there when the Romans were there. And in 70 AD, Rome genocided Judea. They just killed everyone they could. There was a siege of Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed by fire. That was in 70 AD. And 72, 73 AD, there was the siege of Masada, which was a mountain outside of Judea. And there's a whole myth, all kinds of myths and stories have risen up over Masada about how nearly 1,000 Jewish warriors committed suicide rather than be in the hands of Romans. And I don't know if it's true or not, but this actually brings me to another point. Jews are incredibly good storytellers. I mean, to have the Bible that was written in parts 4,000 years ago, and we're still reading it today, you have to be pretty good at writing stories to do that. Now, whether it's a book of myths or a book of mixes, a mix of instructions, myths, poems, songs, telling you to behave yourself, telling you to kill everyone that God doesn't like. I don't know, but it does exist. But that's my point. Jews are incredibly good storytellers then, and they're incredibly good storytellers today. I'm sorry, I need to explain the difference between Jews are not a monolith. There's so many different types of Jews. Russian Jews are not the same as French Jews, and German Jews, not the same as American Jews, Israeli Jews. Around after the Romans were in Israel and they did all this destruction, what was interesting to me is that Judaism blossomed. It didn't die, it actually blossomed. People were converting to Judaism very rapidly. And it's like, what? Why? Well, quite simply, the Romans had all these gods, and you had to, do penance in the blood of oxes and all kinds of things. And when you've got however many gods, 12, 20 gods to appease, I mean, it's quite a lot of hard work. Having one God was a lot easier. And the other thing, of course, going back to the Bible, Jews were always very interested in education and reading. And that was very, very attractive to people. And by the time Constantine came along in the 3rd century and made everyone become Christian, it was actually a toss-up whether Rome was going to become Jewish or Christian. So around this time then, when there were a whole lot of Jews in Rome that were all converts, and they were in Ethiopia, and they were all over wherever anyone went. So this idea that Jews had to leave Israel, and that's where they all came from, that apparently is a myth. But like a lot of myths, I mean, I believe my own myths, but that myth is part of the reason that Israel exists. The idea that Jews came home. And yeah, it's actually very interesting. And because I'm thinking, okay, because all we've really heard since I was born really is how Jews are persecuted. And so why would anyone want to become Jewish? Well, it was a very attractive proposition. The other thing about Jews, and I'm not quite sure when this happened, but sometime between the 3rd century and the 10th century, Jews moved over from being academics and doctors and all other things, and they moved over to becoming a separate class of people in all kinds of countries where they were in charge of the money. And according to Hannah Arendt, what happened was that in the French Revolution in 1789, suddenly society was becoming egalitarian, and you couldn't be a Jewish person on the out with no privileges, because everyone had to have, say, equality, fraternity, liberty. And so the whole system of Jews being a reserved class and outside politics, outside religion, outside social structures, that all sort of started collapsing. And Jews went to universities. And in England, they became members of parliament. But anyway, I'm going ahead of myself. Let me get back. Okay, we're now in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century. The beginning of the 19th century was the Napoleonic Wars, and it was very expensive. And by that time, the Rothschilds had become preeminent financiers in Europe. And there were a lot of Rothschilds. They were children of Maya Rothschild, who, I tell you, there's so many Rothschilds, it's so confusing. But there was a Maya Rothschild in Germany. And in Germany, they had all these kings and princes all over the place and all sorts of different, very confusing. But one of them, one of these princes had a whole lot of money, and a Rothschild took care of it and buried it so that it wouldn't be stolen. And he let his own money be stolen instead. So when the prince came back and saw how honest this Rothschild had been, he just made him incredibly wealthy. And his 5 sons went to 5 capitals of Europe and set up banking houses. One was in Italy, one was in London, one was in Frankfurt, one was in France. Where's the other one? Germany. So only the ones in England and France survived the Second World War. But meanwhile, the Rothschilds funded the Napoleonic Wars for Britain, which of course made them very, very popular in Britain. And in the middle of the 19th century, the Rothschilds, an amazing story. The British government was about to lose the Suez Canal, and they had 4 hours before it was going to be owned by, I don't know, Egypt or France. And one of the Rothschilds, I think it was Lionel, who was by then a member of parliament. He arranged a loan for the British government for this massive amount of money within 4 hours. So I haven't really talked about anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is real and was real. And you can see too that as the Rothschilds are sort of moving out of their lane from just being bankers to becoming lords, they became peers. They were marrying into the aristocratic families of Britain. And half of the Rothschilds were not interested in. In the middle of the 19th century was when Zionism started flowering, although it certainly wasn't the first time that it had come up, the idea of Jews having their own state. But half of the Rothschilds said, well, wait a minute, we're really happy in England. We don't mind being English. And the other Rothschilds were saying, my gosh, we've become too powerful. We have to find our own state. And the Rothschilds, by the end of the 19th century, started funding a whole lot of people, Russian Jews, to move out of Russia into Palestine. And that was funded by several of the Rothschilds. Now, why were the Russians moving out of Russia? Because by the 1880s, there were these massive pogroms in Russia. So suddenly a whole lot of Jews were starting to be killed. Now, Russian Jews were in a pretty bad state anyway. They were only allowed to live in a particular area of Russia. And then things were miserable for them. So these were not the educated Jews. These were not the Rothschilds. These were basically people who were working in farms, and they were working for people, and every now and then some Cossacks came and just, burned everything and destroyed everything and killed themselves. It killed them. It wasn't a pleasant situation. So a whole lot of Russian Jews moved to Palestine in about the 1880s. By about the 1870s, people were starting to talk about a Zionist state. And so you already have some Russian Jews living in Palestine. And then along came a journalist called Theodore Herzl. I don't know what that humming noise is. And Theodore Herzl was an Austrian journalist and lawyer. And he was what he called himself a secular Jew. He was not a religious Jew. He thought that was a whole lot of nonsense. But he decided that since he came from a Jewish family, that was his identity. He was ethnically Jewish. And that's something, it's interesting that a lot of Americans I've talked to haven't really understood. In Germany, you were Jewish even if you weren't. If you had a grandfather who was Jewish, you were Jewish. And that, of course, is what happened to my family. Okay. So we've heard about Theodore Herzl. He wrote a book called The Jewish State in 1896, and then he started having conferences. He died in 1904. I think it's very interesting that the current head general, commander-in-chief, whatever you call it, of the Israeli Defense Force, his name is Herzl, Herzl Halevi. And I discovered that because I wanted to see I heard that Israelis have an enormous amount of skin cancer because they're in the desert. And I wanted to see if I couldn't find any evidence of that, but I found a statistician called Halevi, who had been British. He moved to Palestine. And in one of his papers, he dedicated the paper to his son, Herzl Halevi, who died in the Six-Day War. And I looked up Herzl Halevi, and guess what? The commander-in-chief of the Israeli Defense Force is the nephew who was named after this dead son. And he was just appointed in 2023, and he's an Orthodox Jew, the first Orthodox Jew to lead the Israeli Defense Force. And also he lives in Palestinian territory. So he's one of these settlers that have just moved in, one of the 800,000 Israelis who've moved into Palestinian territory and are causing a whole lot of trouble. Okay, this is a book from one of my favorite biochemists, maybe my favorite biochemist, Hans Krebs, who won the Nobel Prize in 1954 for citric acid cycle. So anyway, he was born Jewish in 1900. So around all this time, now remember I said that Herzl died in 1904. This is all pre-war, pre-First World War. But there were things were happening. People were talking about Zionism. Lord Rothschild had already funded these Russian Jews to live in Palestine. So here, page 6 of Sir Hans Krebs' book, he says, there was an anti-Semitic gutter press and a number of widely read books. One of these books was by Adolf Sturcker, chaplain to the Kaiser, and a politician who funded a specifically anti-Semitic political party. His views were based on religious and nationalistic beliefs, and his activities were directed especially against the liberal policies of Social Democrats. Another book, which was very popular in Germany, was by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British writer who styled himself cultural philosopher and who believed in the superiority of the Nordic races. A more academic book, which I studied in my teens, was by Eugene Düring. The reactions of German Jews varied. The Zionists' answer was a return to the Promised Land. Others preferred to hold to tradition and to demonstrate this openly. A third group, to which my father belonged, believed that the only real answer lay in assimilation. Believing as he did, he went so far as to deny his sons any Jewish religious teaching. But since some kind of religious instruction was then compulsory in Germany, Wolf and I attended scripture lessons in school. Okay, so this is a Jew. In 1933, within a few days of Hitler's assumption to power, Nazi uniforms appeared everywhere. Colleagues in the hospital he was a physician and as well as a scientist. Colleagues in the hospital who had admitted at most only mild sympathies with Hitler were suddenly to be seen in the uniforms of Nazi organizations. One wore 3 stars, indicating senior rank. Many had been secret members for years. So for some 8 weeks until the end of March, work in the hospital and the lab went along almost normally. On the 12th of April, I received a curt, formal, impersonal letter from the dean of the faculty, the professor of surgery, E. Rain, officially informing me that at the request of the Minister of Education, I was to consider myself on immediate leave of absence. And that's what happened. Kicked out. And then he went to England and had a fantastic career and wrote in English, which was good for me, my German being a little on the shaky side. Okay, well, that was Sir Hans Krebs. Now I can tell you about my own in-laws. There were three brothers from Stuttgart. Their father was a rabbi. Their mother was a Levy. There was a Levy who won a Nobel Prize for acetylcholinesterase in 1936 from Austria, and he was a second cousin, first cousin, whatever it was. So here were these three brothers coming from a Jewish family, very well educated, because I said at the beginning, one reason, I think perhaps a major reason that Jews were resented was because they were very interested, they were very bright and very interested in education. And that, of course, is true today. So two of these brothers ended up near Frankfurt in Florsheim, and they built a pharmaceutical factory. Dr. Ugo then, I mean, it was a big factory. Now it was torn down. The factory was torn down in around I think around 2000. And there's an Aldi and a Ruhr, and I mean, there's an enormous number. It's a quite sizable shopping center now. There was a very big space. And here's a patent from Uncle Ugo. Process of freeing waters containing cyanids and sulfur cyanids from poisons. US patent accepted 1906, January 23rd. So they were there, and his brother Otto, Dr. Otto, was also a chemist, and he was busy working in the lab. They were having a lovely time. So here they'd gone to this little village outside of Frankfurt, and which was desperately poor, and they had turned it around. They had given people jobs. And the Nazis came along in 1933 when both Otto and Ugo were dead, and they took the factory. And the two young cousins of my mother-in-law were, well, one died, they were both killed. One in Theresienstadt, and the other one was murdered in Frankfurt. He was given poison. So my late husband was born in Nazi Germany to a woman whose father was a Jew, and she'd never been in a synagogue, but that's the thing. Whether this idea that you're Jewish because you come from a Jewish family, whether this came about because of Zionism, I don't know. But it seemed like it happened at the same time. Sir Hans Krebs has married an English woman, and his children are all, Church of England or whatever. I don't think anyone would ever think anyone was Jewish anymore. Which, anyway, I've got a lot more. I hope this is all making sense. It really is all over the place. Okay. Where did the genocide today come from? Now, first of all, it depends on who you talk to. For me, it's very clear that when an occupying force that runs a country like a concentration camp, where you can't get in or out, that to me is you're killing your prisoners. Others are calling it a war. I don't think it's a war. I think for a war you have to have I don't know, but that's another case of language being used to. Oh, wait a minute. I don't know if this video is going to be worth watching, but we're going to have it. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, let's go back to these Russian Jews that showed up in Palestine in the 1880s because of things were just really horrible for them. And they're working on the ground, and they're getting along well with the Arabs, the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians, meanwhile, are well educated. They have cities, they have universities. The Palestinians, depending on who you read, are the descendants of the Jews that were there in 2,000 years ago. And the Palestinians were the Philistines. This is one thing that's not appreciated, is that Palestinians are very interested in education. During this bombing that started on October 8th, there were 11 universities in Gaza, and every single one of them has been blown up by controlled demolition. That was by the end of January. Every single one. Every single school has been blown up. It's heartbreaking. But this image of Palestinians as being a bunch of ratbags that don't belong anywhere. 5.7 million Palestinians. Anyway, I just want to focus on 1917. Now, in 1917, the First World War had been going on for 3 years. It started in August 4th, 1914, went on till November 11th, 1918. Now, the United States came in 1918, and of course, Britain was very grateful they did. I'm not quite sure what the contribution was, but I know that my family were pretty much annihilated in the First World War. My English grandfather had 9 first cousins killed in the First World War because soldiers were being sent into machine guns that just sort of, ripped them apart. So when you have the British Army losing men the way they were, they needed more. See, as pacifists and as Quakers, I mean, it's impossible for us to understand why that would ever be a priority, but it was, and there were some very enterprising people, better educated amongst the Russian Jews in Palestine, who decided that it might be in their interest to be fighting in this war because it was a world war. So they went to the Sultan, because Palestine was still owned by Turkey, and they asked the Turks if they were interested in having a mercenary Russian troop of all these chaps from Palestine. And the Turks arrested them, kicked them out of the country. So these enterprising people showed up in London and said, okay, well, what about you? We'll be British. The Turks don't want us. They don't want us fighting on the German side, so we'll fight on the English side. And the English said, sure. And that is how the Zionist Mule Corps was formed. But actually, it's an even more interesting story than that. The person who was in charge of putting the corps together was called John Henry Patterson, who was an English soldier and a very colorful character. He had been won all kinds of awards in South Africa in the Boer War. And then something weird happened. I think he kept on getting kicked out of the army or something, and they kept taking him back because they needed people. But at one stage, he was running safaris. I'm not sure where. It might have been Kenya. And he took this lord and the lord's wife and some other people on this safari. And in the first day or two, there was a loud gunshot and the Lord's son was killed. And being a practical sort of person, he just buried the guy, and the Lord's wife moved in with him, and they carried on with their vacation. He was exonerated of murder and everything else, but I mean, his behavior was just pretty bizarre. So the British Army were very happy to put him in charge of this ragtag Russian group of people. The Zionist Mule Corps. And it was called the Zionist Mule Corps because there were mules. And the whole point of these mules was taking supplies to people on the front line. And meanwhile, Winston Churchill was running around Whitehall saying, oh, we need to have another front. We're just sending all the men to the European front, to Germany and France. We need to open another front. And what we can do is, he looked at a map, said we can go and take Turkey, and we can do it through Gallipoli, through the Dardanelles. And a lot of people said, you're crazy, but for reasons that don't make any sense at all, Churchill's plan was approved. And so masses of young men were sent to the Dardanelles and to Gallipoli. And this was why I know about it so well, because this was the first time that the Australian Army fought as the Australian Army and not as the British Army, and the New Zealand Army as well. They were called Anzacs. So they landed on the 25th of April, 1915, and were slaughtered, absolutely slaughtered. But, rules are rules, and they kept there, and they kept sending in reinforcements, and kept getting slaughtered. And they were there for 8 months, these soldiers, these British soldiers, Canadian, Australian, New Zealanders, all flying under their own flag. Massive disaster, which followed Churchill for the rest of his life. It wasn't the only blunder he made. However, meanwhile, the Zionist Mule Corps were just excelling in what they were doing. They had been trained very well by Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Patterson to not only take care of the mules, but also to fire weapons. So they were taught everything a British soldier was taught, as well as bringing supplies to soldiers on the front line. And they did very, very well, and they certainly had casualties, but nothing like the casualties of people on the front line. And they did so well that the British Army just, they gave them all kinds of awards. And in the Second World War, the British Army was very happy to have a Jewish contingent, Jewish military. So in 1947, the United Nations ruled that Palestine could be partitioned, and Israel, the state of Israel, came into being in May 1948. After quite an enormous campaign of PR and also military. I mean, there were a whole lot of these British trained soldiers blowing up British soldiers in Palestine, which then belonged to Britain. I don't quite understand how. I hope this is making sense because it's a very confusing time. So Israel, the state of Israel was there, and no one asked the Palestinians. And 800,000 Palestinians were pushed out of their homes in Jerusalem and in all other kinds of areas because the whole area of Palestine was divided into Israel and Palestine. And since then, Palestinians have not had a state. They have been their homes, and yeah, that's been very interesting reading. Edward Said, S-A-I-D. He died in 2003. He was a professor of English in Columbia, beautifully well-spoken. And his wife, Miriam Said, is still alive, and she went to school at in the Lebanese Quaker school, Rumana High School. So that's essentially what happened. You know, they went from thinking it was a good idea to have a Zionist state to having one within 50 years. Now, you know, I explained that there are plenty of people who weren't interested in having a Zionist state, including Lothar, my late husband. I had thought that because he was, you know, classified as Jewish, and he called himself Jewish. In the biography of Primo Levi, Lothar is even mentioned as a Jew. That that he was a Jew. One quote, which because he had a Jewish grandfather. I thought that was interesting. Yeah. So, any questions? Have I confused you completely?
Good reminder. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, one thing that I've come across too is that you know, I've been accused of all kinds of things, but for me, I mean, what I was trying to do was find out what happened and why did it happen. Why does the United States fund Israel when it's a very well-to-do country at this stage? They have investments everywhere. They're very wealthy, and we're giving them, was it $13 billion this year? Or was it 70 billion? I mean, an enormous amount of money. And I haven't really been able to find the answer. I've heard President Biden said that if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. And I've also read that Republican support is very, very strong for Israel. But I've also read Republicans say, well, you know, it's a floating battleship. It's a battleship that unsinkable. That's it. It's an unsinkable battleship. That's what Israel is. So it's a way of getting arms into that whole region. I read an essay that was written in 2018 explaining what the special relationship is between Israel and the United States. Apparently, Israel originally had this special relationship with France But France got out of it in about the 1970s, and then America became the special friend. But I'm not quite sure. I really don't understand. I'm told it's something to do with massive gas deposits in the Red Sea, right off Gaza, or it's something to do with having access to oil in Saudi Arabia. I'm absolutely not sure. But I do know that genocide is going on, and Ramadan is starting on the 10th of March. And Ramadan, as you know, you don't eat from dawn till dusk, except it's dawn and dusk in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, you don't get out of it by living by being in a northern hemisphere city where it's cold. So here you have people who are already starving, who are going to take part in Ramadan. I mean, it's just horrific. Yeah. Oh, I talked a little bit about Hannah Arendt. She, you probably know, she was a witness of the Nuremberg trials, and she's the one that talked about the banality of evil. But she wrote a number of books, and what she wrote about anti-Semitism and about the idea of Jews always being victims. And she said, that's nonsense. Of course it's nonsense. Often, I mean, throughout history, being Jewish was a really cool thing to be, and people were becoming Jewish because of that. This is the thing. I mean, people jump around with their religions. My grandfather was born to two Quakers who had the same last name and may have been first cousins. I'm not quite sure. And he was brought up as an Anglican. A lot of people became Church of England in England and Ireland in the 19th century. And before that, because they couldn't go to university if they weren't Anglican. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons people change their religions. And I'm sure that's just as likely with people who are Jewish as well as anything else. If they can, you know. Yeah, there, of course, there have been horrible things have happened to Jews in history. Jews were kicked out of Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. They were just, I guess, because they were well educated and they started to become too powerful. And that's always a threat. Being educated is very threatening to dictators and other things. Yeah. So, but anyway, Hannah Arendt, as far as she could see in Germany, she thought that Judaism was actually dying out in Germany because people were becoming assimilated. I mean, I read that part from Hans Krebs, and I told you the story of my own in-laws who married Catholic women. You know, these Jewish industrialists married Catholic women, and no one in that family ever went into a synagogue. They were married in Catholic churches too. So
Hannah Arendt was briefly, maybe not so briefly, incarcerated in a concentration camp.
Was she? I did not. I didn't.
She was. She had experience as a prisoner in a concentration camp. Wow. It may have been brief, but it was there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to read through all of her work. It's very interesting. Yeah, but she talks about anti-Semitism, and in a way that's the thing. She said that anti-Semitism was different in the 1950s than it was in 1200. I mean, anti-Semitism in Shakespeare's time. I mean, Merchant of Venice. Shylock was a Jew. I mean, that's a very nasty thing. Shakespeare wrote about Shylock. What bothers me, though, is American Jews talking about anti-Semitism. They're saying that they're experiencing anti-Semitism when they have very fancy university degrees, very high achieving positions, and they're walking around without bodyguards, and they're still American citizens. I mean, anti-Semitism is what happened to my mother-in-law. In 1933, she was 17. She had her German citizenship removed from her because her father was Jewish. Her father, who died when she was 5 years old. And suddenly it's like, you're an enemy of the state. And when Lothar was born in 1941 in Wiesbaden, he was born illegally because a non-Jew was not allowed, a German was not allowed to have any kind of relations with a Jew, which is what she was considered. So that's anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is like Hans Kreuz. It's like, okay, well, you've done very well. I gave you this great recommendation for a job 5 months ago, but no, go away. And because he was already, he'd already published some pretty amazing papers, he was able to go to Britain and was just taken in by British scientists, and eventually went to the University of Sheffield, which always interested me because my mother, as a young physician, was in Sheffield at the same time as he was. I just thought, gee, because I can remember asking her, did you ever meet him? It's like, no, I guess she was just working too hard with people who'd been bombed and things. And he was, yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah. So anything else? Thank you for that comment, though. I will find out. Yeah. Yeah, there's an enormous amount of things that I didn't go through because it's just a huge topic. But the important thing to remember is the Zionist mules. I mean, that's where it all started. If these Russian hadn't wanted to be mercenaries and be trained by the British Army, the IDF wouldn't have gotten started.
Incidentally, there was a movement in the early 1900s by a wealthy French Jewish man to resettle fleeing Russian Jews in South Jersey in the area of Vineland. And there are Jewish agrarian communities down there. They're not agrarian anymore, but there's a village called Rosenhain. There are other villages down there that barely still exist, but a number of very prominent Americans grew up and came out of those little villages, which were communal communities founded for fleeing Russian Jews in the middle of the 1900s. And there's a University of Pennsylvania book, which tells all of that history. It's right there.
Okay. That's absolutely fascinating, because I read that in the when people were fleeing Russia after the pogroms, half of them came to the United States and half of them went to Palestine. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, they came to New York, and then Baron de Hirsch and his foundation resettled them in South Jersey, intending it to be farming village communes, but they were city educated, largely Russians, and they had other ideas. One became a member of the New Jersey Supreme Court. One, I used to know that some of the names of the prominent people who came out of those communities.
That's amazing. Wow, that's great. Yeah.
In our backyard.
Wow.
I wrote an article, I researched it and wrote an article in our local newspaper one time.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's, that's the thing. I mean, when you're a refugee and you're bright and you've got another opportunity, you do what you can, which is really great.
I'm going to have to go.
Yes.
Thanks for the program.
Thank you.
I'll do research